Hey everyone, I have another sketchbook oil painting for you today. This time in a new Moleskine cahier I've had lying around for a couple of years. I started a second painting sketchbook since oils take some time to cure, and I don't want to be stuck waiting for a page to dry. I was also curious how well this paper would hold up to a few coats of gesso and the oil paint. Moleskine sketchbooks are so nice and durable, it seems like the perfect choice for a long-term painting book. And as a bonus, there's a very big texture difference between this and the Canson watercolor book I also recently started, so the more options I have, the better. I start out by throwing down a very quick rough sketch in burnt umber. This time I'm using linseed oil with my Gamblin paint. Much like my Isaac Clarke painting last week, this is still very much another experiment with oil paint as I continue learning the medium. I'm expecting the linseed oil to add much more fluidity to the paint compared to the liquid I previously used. Plus, since I know it's going to dry slower, I'll get to see how difficult painting wet on wet is. Since I got over the initial hurdle of trying these paints out last week, I decided to try a more difficult subject with straightforward goals in mind. I of course chose Samus from Metroid Prime. With Nintendo surprise dropping the remaster on us, and again being unable to play it, this would be the next best thing for me. Not only did I love the original Metroid Prime, and most of the Metroid games in general, but Samus as a character is one of the original badasses in gaming. Before Master Chief, before Doom Guy, and even before BJ Blazkowicz, there was Samus, rocking her sweet power armor and kicking alien ass. Anyways, I wanted to try and capture some of that reflective metal and really push the hue variety within the light reflections. In hindsight, this was likely far too difficult a task for only my second oil painting, and working alla prima is about to kick my ass, but we'll get there. Things start off well enough. I began by blocking out some of the larger areas of color, being careful to not just fill everything at once. The kind of work I'm striving for here is really more of a fight with the palette than it is the painting. I'm going to have to figure out my color mixes and very carefully choose when and where to apply them over the white surface. With my primary goal being to capture reflectivity and hue variation, this proved to be very challenging. If I lay in the wrong colors too soon, I'm likely going to end up mixing mud on the surface, trying to correct them later. So this painting is very much a test of color mixing and patience, two things I'm not very good at, but also why I chose this subject matter in the first place. I want to push myself harder here than I did on my previous painting. Gotta get out of my comfort zone. The more I paint this, the more I'm seeing the differences with linseed oil versus liquid. I'm definitely getting a more fluid paint, even with very little linseed. It's also leaving very visible brushstrokes. I try my best to control the direction of the strokes, being mindful of the forms I'm painting. Not to mention, this is a much smoother surface, and it's offering very little resistance. I'm actually rather enjoying how well the Moleskine is handling the paint. It's at this point that she's almost completely blocked in, and I'm working on capturing some of those environmental reflections on her suit. It's also where I'm realizing, even with a much slower and methodical approach than I'm normally used to, I still made some big mistakes with placing some colors down way too soon. I filled out large areas that I should have slowly added in more hue variety and tonal transitions, because now I'm stuck adding wet paint over top, and we're gonna get muddy. I know a lot of alla prima is obviously mixing paint on the surface, but still it was a real struggle. My painting inexperience was getting the better of me, and slowly my mindset was shifting towards negativity as I neared the end. I know I could have added some thicker paint over top to try and prevent it mixing too much, or even come back in a week or so once it's dry to add more layers, but I was starting to feel defeated. What I had so far wasn't at all what I was hoping to capture. Even with all my planning, I left very few areas to hit with lighter colors to really capture the different hues and reflectivity in the metals. With studies or exercises like these, I always go into them with very specific goals in mind. Even more so here, since I know I'm inexperienced with oil paint, let alone traditional media. After last week's painting, I really thought that if I just took it slow and paid attention to my color mixing, I'd be able to pull it off in one go without much need for layering. When I realized I couldn't, I let myself give up, which only resulted in greater self-disappointment. I've been creating art for nearly a decade now. I'm probably well into the thousands of pieces made, and I've worked hard to avoid these kinds of feelings. It's one thing to dislike the results, but I wanted to give up at the end. Even scrap this recording and start a new painting for a different video altogether. I mixed whatever I had left on the palette and slapped it in the background before calling it quits. The next day, I walked into my studio and looked at the painting with fresh eyes and a new light. And you know what? It's not that terrible. It looks like Samus, there's some strong colors, and in some areas I was able to at least imply some of the reflectivity. Sure, it's messy, and I've got some proportional issues as usual, but it's not the worst thing ever. In fact, it's probably a good start to a better painting, if anything. Almost all the color information is there, and nearly everything is roughly where it should be. So what if I failed? If I've learned anything over the years, it's that failure is nothing more than a learning opportunity. The only real failure is not trying at all, or refusing to learn from mistakes. After all, I was enjoying the process, because I always do, and I know that this can be done the way I want. It's just gonna take time. So I think it's time to critique this painting, learn everything I can from it, and once again paint over it in Photoshop. This time, however, I feel like I have something to prove to myself. There was no reason to get upset over an oil sketch in a sketchbook. In fact, looking at it now, I do think everything is there to make it into a good painting. If nothing else, I can show you how to get a painting out of its ugly phase and into something more polished and final. Alright, now that we have this in Photoshop, I'm going to quickly self-critique it, then move on to correcting any issues that I point out. In my previous video where I painted Isaac Clarke, I go into a bit more detail about this self-criticism technique, so check that out if you're interested in hearing more. Basically, I'm going to ask myself what works, what doesn't work, and what if. So what works? Well, on the whole, I do think this reads as Samus. It's got all the correct shapes and design language you'd expect to see. Plus, I do think that all the colors are really close to the correct tones and values. How about what doesn't work? I think once again the glaring issue for me is simply related to proportions. I think this shoulder is a little too high up, it should be further back in perspective. This part of her ribcage is a little too low. Overall, the chest piece could be turned away from us slightly. Little things like that. These will all be really easy to fix in Photoshop though. The biggest thing that bothers me is the metal doesn't read like shiny metal very well, which, if you remember, was my major goal with this sketch, so I feel I did kind of fail in that regard. I wanted to push really vibrant and different hues of reflective light, as well as capture that shiny metal aesthetic within the local light source, so that's definitely going to be my primary focus in the paint over. Finally, the what if is a bit of a cop-out. Much like my last piece, I slapped a background on from leftover paints I had on the palette. I'm working with very small paint tubes, and I don't have very much of them, and I'm still pretty frugal with them. So when it comes to the backgrounds, I kind of just rolled what's left over on the palette. So what if I replaced it with something more high contrast and complementary to her shape and color? As a bonus what if, well, the more I looked at this, the more I realized it's really just an incomplete finished painting. Meaning, this is just the ugly stage of a better piece. And I'm pretty confident that I can show you what putting just a few more hours into a piece like this can do. All the information I already need is there in the sketch. It just needs a little more love. Okay, with all that said, let's get to work. So here in Photoshop, I'm once again going to use the lasso tool to select and copy paste every part of her onto a new layer. This is so I can freely move and warp everything into its correct position before I begin painting. I could just paint directly over the photo or use liquify to move things around, but since I'm going to be doing a substantial amount of painting this time around, I find this process to be the quickest and easiest. Once I have everything where I want it, I decide for this one, I'm going to heavily utilize the mixer brush. I actually rarely use it because I've yet to figure out a workflow with it. I find it to be a very difficult tool to use. Probably because it's a lot like painting wet on wet, so my inexperience definitely holds me back. Since I'm planning to treat the photo as an underpainting, and a lot of the brushwork has a lot of hard edges to them, I figure I'll get some mixer brush practice in by using it to blend all the colors together. My plan is to establish where all the value and color shifts will occur using some softer mixer brushes. Then, when I come back to paint in the actual light and details, I'll use some hard edge brushes to really make it all pop. My hope is to end up with some nice edge control with the variety of lost and hard edges acting as focal points throughout. So with all that being said, the majority of this painting is already done. Really, before I even dropped it into Photoshop, it was ready for this stage. From here on out, it's just about rendering, and for this one, I'm actually planning on pushing it through to a more completed finish. I not only want to prove to myself that I can do this, I was just a little held back by the medium, but also to show that the original painting wasn't that bad. It was just kind of the start of something greater, and it's sometimes worth pushing through a painting to get to the better stage. Paintings often have an ugly phase, and sometimes it takes a lot of work to get them out of that. It's important to realize and recognize when a painting can be saved. Now I want to take this time to talk about some things I touched on earlier, namely setting goals and failure. I see a lot of artists that are chasing the ever-elusive getting good, which is great. It's certainly a starting point. But what is it that you want to get good at? Oftentimes, the answer is very vague and mostly encompasses just being good at art. That's fine. We all want to be good at art, right? But without knowing where you want to end up, how are you supposed to know which way you have to go to get there? If, for example, you wanted to be a character artist, you could probably lay off studying environments and instead focus harder on, say, anatomy. If you're trying to be a concept artist, then maybe learning design fundamentals is more important than practicing illustration principles all the time. These are some small examples, but the point is, figure out your end goal so you could plan out how to get there. What if we take this further than that, though? A common piece of advice for achieving things in life is setting not only long-term goals, but several short-term goals that are easier to achieve. This makes the path between goalposts clearer and provides more positive reinforcement along the way. Like with this painting. Initially, I mentioned all I really wanted to do was capture the reflectivity in the metal and really push the hue variety in the light reflections. That's it. Sure, finishing with a great piece of art is always welcome, but I still set very clear goals ahead of any sort of exercise like this. My Isaac Clarke painting, for example, that goal was just to start a damn painting sketchbook already, using oil paints that had been collecting dust. That's really all there is to it. They can be as simple as getting something done, or as specific as practicing a technique you really want to focus on. Combine this with enjoying the process, and you're bound for success. But what happens if you fail your goals? We've all been there, feeling like I was the night I finished this painting. I missed the mark, wasn't good enough. I even set a goal I felt I could achieve, and still failed. Only, did I really fail? It wasn't a complete loss, certainly not the worst art I've ever made, but what if it was actually the worst? Would that change anything? I still sat there and made the conscious decision to work on improving myself in some way. That in itself is worth celebrating, right? The most valuable thing I have now is a result, something I can look at and learn from. I can analyze what went right and what went wrong. This failure is now the perfect learning opportunity. It's information, pieces to the puzzle that I can use to help me succeed the next time. And you know what? Maybe I'll fail again. But each time I'm working towards that solution, gaining more and more information along the way. Failure is simply a part of the process. You need to fail, because if you're not, then it means you're not even trying. And in trying nothing, you give up everything. All this to say, I found myself upset. Not at the quality of the painting, but my attitude towards it. I've learned this damn lesson already, multiple times even. Probably will again in the near future too. For now though, I decided that I was going to prove to myself that this process works. This supposed failure of a painting is really just the start of a better painting that I'm not quite able to make yet with oils. I damn sure bet I can paint this in Photoshop though, and in doing so, I'm learning from those mistakes. I'm seeing what I have to do to correct them in the future, and eventually avoid them altogether. I'm learning from this failure. Anyways, getting back to this painting, it's almost done. In the end, I wanted the background to be something vertical, since she's got a lot of round and curved elements to her design. As I was painting, I tried wrapping the brushstrokes around the forms, so in the end I ended up with a lot of circular and curved brushstrokes. This makes the vertical prominent strokes in the background a perfect contrast, I feel. I applied a slight blur to it since it was a little too hard, and finished with the quick level adjustment, really pushing its contrast up. I toyed with adding a saturated complementary color around Samus's silhouette. Kind of a poor man's version of chromatic aberration effect, just to experiment a little bit. I kind of like it, so I left it in. Finally, a very small level adjustment on her, just to slightly darken her against the now bright background. And finally, after all that, we can call this one done. Alright, here we are, my finished painting. I gotta say, I'm very pleased with how this one turned out. I feel I addressed every criticism I had with it, and then some. I admit, I could push it even further, and correct some more issues that I see. But I'm not trying to turn this into a 12-hour piece. In the end, the oil painting was about 3 hours, and this Photoshop painting was another 4. You can see besides the obvious corrections to some of the proportional problems, I really focused on trying to capture that reflective metal, and I think it paid off. So really quick, putting these side by side, you can see they're really not that different from each other, especially zooming out. Yeah, the one on the right looks better of course, but overall, I mean, they're nearly identical. All the information is still pretty much the same. It just goes to show you how important the initial stages of a finished piece are, and seeing these side by side now in hindsight, I consider the oil sketch on the left quite a success for what it was. This also reinforces my point of setting goals before doing exercises like these. If I hadn't set some very specific tasks to accomplish with the oil sketch, I likely would have never arrived at this painting at all. I certainly wouldn't have made a video preaching about setting goals and learning from failure, which in turn only further solidifies the concepts within my own psyche. So hey, in the end, we're all winner. Well, I really hope you all enjoyed this video, maybe even learned a thing or two. I certainly had a ton of fun making it. If you like this kind of content, please leave a like and subscribe if you're not already. Visit ascentintomadness.com for more of my work and all my social links, of course. I also have a Patreon where the entire video process of both these paintings is available, with high-resolution images of these and all the other work you see on the channel. And that's all I have for you today, so I'll see you next time.